Welcome back to If This Is True, the place where I like to dig up the facts behind the nonsense and the propaganda that's being stuffed down our throats every day. And today I thought we'd talk about heat pumps. And I'm going to be really transparent here, and I'm going to tell you up front, embarrassingly, I am one of the Muppets who was led to believe it would be a really great idea in my house, and it did seem like a good idea at the time, but it's not. And this chat that we're going to have today is about the madness of a technology that actually doesn't work very well, costs a fortune, and will drive your neighbours crazy. It's pretty much an all-round useless replacement of the gas system, which works perfectly well for half the cost, no noise, and better efficiency in most of Britain's housing stock. Now, the government can't stop talking about that they're the future of heating, how they'll save us all from climate disaster, but that really is not true. And I'm going to tell you all the stuff that they won't. You see, I believe in freedom of information, and I don't like propaganda. It makes for bad choices, and right now it looks like you might not be able to make a choice for much longer at all. If we don't do as they want us to do, then we'll be forced to do it. Something that requires you to be punished or coerced into doing is something you probably wouldn't decide to have or to do in the first place. And where have you heard that before? So are they really the answer to all of our heating problems? Well, spoiler alert, not for most of us. So let's start with how heat pumps are supposed to work. I'm sure that lots of people do know, but many probably don't. So instead of burning fossil fuels to generate heat, they move it, and they work like a kind of a fridge in reverse, pulling heat from the outside and bringing it into your home, or the other way around if you use it as an air conditioning unit. Now, I know that sounds a bit mental, because if it's colder outside to start with, then how can that cold air be moved around to become warm air? Well, here's the science bit, favourite part, as you know. The science lies in a chemical substance inside the heat pump that's called a refrigerant. And this fluid has a very low boiling point, so it can evaporate and turn into a gas at much lower temperatures than something like water. The process works a bit like your cooling system in your fridge. Refrigerant. It is a chemical. How's that for the environment? Well, refrigerants come at an enormous environmental cost. Most modern refrigerants, like things called HFCs, have very high global warming potential, meaning they can trap heat in the atmosphere much more effectively than carbon dioxide, which we're supposed to be getting rid of. And the more of these heat pumps we install, the bigger the problem will get. And yes, almost all of the heat pumps installed in the UK are made in China, or their components are made in China, using vast quantities of coal and oil. Anyway, I've digressed. Let's get back to how it works. So, the refrigerant inside the heat pump absorbs heat from the outside air, even in temperatures as low as 0 degrees or colder. Once the refrigerant turns into a gas, it's compressed by a compressor inside the heat pump, and the compression increases the temperature of that gas dramatically, much higher than the outside air. And then this hot pressurized gas is passed through a heat exchange inside the heat pump, where it transfers its heat into the air or water that's used in your radiators. And as it loses the heat, the gas cools down, turns back into a liquid, and the whole cycle starts again. Sounds great, right? Even in cold temperatures, the refrigerant inside the pump can still absorb the heat from outside. So, for example, air source heat pumps are designed to extract heat from the air, even when it's as cold as, say, -15. But here's the problem. The colder it is, though, the harder the system has to work, which is why it's so much more expensive to run, because it uses so much more electricity. Now, the government wants you to believe that heat pumps are efficient because they don't generate heat, they simply move it. That's their argument. And in a brand new standalone home, not next to neighbours, and with perfect insulation, the system can actually work quite well, as long as you only want to heat it to 19 degrees. There's a reason we're being told we should all have our heating set at 19 degrees, because that's the most efficient temperature for a heat pump. Now, most of us don't live in a brand new house with no new neighbours, and a substantial majority of our housing stock has no insulation and no double glazing. I know that the government is pumping some money into insulation, but not nearly enough, and you can't insulate 200-year-old walls which don't actually have a second skin. It's impossible to do, which means massively increased electricity usage as the heat pump requires so much more energy. Now, I know this for a fact because I have one. And it means that I can confirm to you with first-hand knowledge that my electricity usage is double my previous usage. And I had to install a massive immersion heater to heat the water hotter than lukewarm, because that's another thing they don't tell you. Like most of the housing stock in the UK, it turns out mine doesn't really do very well. And the government is now suggesting that maybe what you're going to need is a heat pump and a boiler, so that heats your water. Imagine the cost of that. So let's consider those costs then, should we? An average heat pump will cost anywhere between £14,000 and £19,000. And if you want a ground source heat pump, why would you ever? That's going to cost you up to about £34,000, depending on how much work you need done. Compare that to traditional boilers. A gas boiler, on average, will cost between £3,000 to £5,000, and oil boilers come in even cheaper than that, at £2,000. The government has had to change the rules slightly so that more houses can get permission for heat pumps in the first place. And when you do get permission, which you need, you'll be given a certificate, which the supplier then redeems as a voucher worth £7,500 from the government, from taxpayers' money, leaving the homeowner with a total cost of between £7,000 and £8,000, which is still much more expensive than either the gas or the oil, at a time when energy prices are continuing to rise and the cost of living is continuing to rise. And don't forget, these subsidies given to those installation businesses are paid for by you in your taxes anyway. The government aims to install 600,000 of these pumps, which is a total tax cost of £4.5 billion of your donations to net zero. How do you feel about paying for half of your neighbour's heat pump? I don't feel great about that. And then there's the problem of your radiators, because if you do have an older property with traditional radiators, they're not up to the task. Heat pumps operate at much lower temperatures, so your current radiators won't be able to provide enough heat, which means you might need to upgrade all of the radiators in your house in addition to the cost of the heat pump. But what about the actual experience of having a heat pump in your home? Well, let's talk about that the government has decided to lower its noise restriction levels so that they can increase sales of these monstrosities. Well, how loud are they? Up to about 70 decibels, which is the same as a vacuum cleaner. So imagine a vacuum cleaner running outside your kitchen window 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for years. And now imagine living on a traditional British street full of terraced houses, or in an apartment surrounded by other apartments. Gardens and balconies are going to be filled with the chorus of buzzing rather than any sort of birdsong. And whilst that might drown out the Sunday morning lawnmowers, it's not exactly peaceful. And there's more, because heat pumps don't just make noise, they also pump out freezing cold air. Like your fridge pumps out warm air at the back, they, when they extract heat, push air that is much, much colder than the ambient temperature outside, as low as -7 degrees, just like the inside of your freezer. So imagine living in that row of terraced houses, rows of heat pumps all kicking out freezing cold air and sounding like a chorus of vacuum cleaners. Not exactly the relaxing environment you had in mind for your barbecue. And it's not just inconvenient for you, it has an impact on wildlife too, especially in the spring when animals rely on the warmth from the sun in your garden to keep them warm. So how is that environmentally friendly or green? It isn't. It isn't either of those things. And then there's the murky bit. They definitely don't tell you this in the sales pitch. The government is heavily subsidising heat pump companies, but they're not offering similar support for any traditional heating systems, so they're messing with the free market. They're actually penalising those people who want to stick with gas boilers by increasing their costs and imposing stricter regulations, putting a tax on your choice. And they will continue to increase the price of traditional boilers until they're the same price as the air source heat pumps, taking away your choice and forcing and fiddling in your market. Not only that, but many housing developers are being refused planning permission to install heat pumps because the local electricity grid is already overloaded. For example, in Reading, developers can't get the green light for new homes with heat pumps because the grid can't handle the extra demand. And this isn't an isolated case. If the UK government has set a target of 600,000 heat pump installations per year by 2028, how on earth is the grid going to handle that kind of load? It's going to cause serious problems, and it's going to cause serious restrictions. The government is pushing for this massive rollout of heat pumps without addressing the infrastructure. It's a classic case of good intentions colliding with complete reality, ideology overriding facts. And the fact is that for the vast majority of homes, heat pumps just aren't a good idea, even on paper. They're expensive to install, costly to run, noisy, disruptive, and not as effective in the vast majority as non-new build homes as normal, traditional boilers. Add that to the strain placed on an already overloaded grid, and the government's push for widespread uptake looks less like a solution and more like another one of Ed's expensive experiments, where we are the ones being experimented on. And history shows us that government intervention in free markets rarely leads to success. When you subsidise one technology whilst penalising others, whilst you have a crumbling infrastructure, it's a recipe for absolute disaster. People just won't take up this technology that gives them a worse standard of living. So in the end, the government will force you. And those who don't, and they continue to hold out, will end up with unsafe and ancient boiler systems, putting themselves at risk, their neighbours at risk, and possibly not even being able to get insurance. That doesn't sound like a free market choice to me. Now, that might not be the case for everybody, and I'm big on your choice. If you have the right kind of house, the right kind of environment, then heat pumps will work adequately. But for the rest of us, the ones that do want to make informed choices, it's an outrage. In my opinion, based on owning one, they're not the solution. So again, I'm telling you, it's time to talk to Ed. It's time to write to your MPs. We need to demand action because the time for silence and propaganda about net zero is over. It's at an end. Let me know what you think. Do you have one? What have you been told about heat pumps? I'd really like to know in the comments. And don't forget, like and subscribe, and we'll do more if this is true content. Let's break down more of this propaganda in this series of videos about net zero. Until next time, thank you.